Before we dive in, and while we're waiting a little bit, I'm curious, what has changed about your impression of music, if anything, from your experiences of the last week and a half in thinking about it and working on the parts,
You cut out for just a sec, Beck. What has changed about what?
about how you think about Beethoven, if anything? Have there been any surprises, or have there been any things, you know, well, okay, now I'm fishing, but I hope is that you've fallen in love with this music. um, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's pretty amazing. If you had to describe it to somebody, what do you love about it?
Oh, I don't know that I was prepared to answer that question, but I will say I have now been started thinking a lot more about like where the quartets are placed in Beethoven's life, which I had kind of, just been like aware, but then not, I wasn't thinking like of like how it related to the symphonies, like we talked about in the seminar yesterday, or like how really groundbreaking the different things that he did in the string quartets was. So
Awesome.
yeah, I started thinking about that more.
You know what, Elizabeth, I'm hearing like every third word or so. Is anyone else having trouble hearing, Elizabeth?
Well, I got it. I
You've
got it.
got it.
Yeah.
Okay. I hope my internet is not being unstable. So if I didn't actually hear what you said, except that relating it to the symphonies was there. Could you try one more time for me?
Yeah.
If I can.
So I was saying just like considering how really groundbreaking different things that Beethoven was doing, like we talked about yesterday, like repeating the development, but then also like not repeating the exposition in one of the quartets, and kind of the weird balances, and then like giving melodies to the cellos and all that.
Yeah, the level of innovation is just incredible, and sort of, remains incredible, right? It's not like he changed the genre and changed writing for sure, but it's not like then that's what everybody just did. It's still very specific to his voice, which is one of the things that is so exciting about it. And one of the reasons why you can spend a whole lifetime with this music and still learn things. Think about that. You put forward ideas, in a manuscript, and years later, all of these musicians over time are poring over these scores, hours and hours spent rehearsing, thinking about a play. I mean, many, many, many more hours spent than he took to actually write it.
It's
And I
certainly
don't think that's stopping anytime soon. So what an incredible thing to bring into the world. It really is something.
it's certainly true
I,
for us in the Fry Street, and is I know true for all of our quartet mentors and chamber music mentors that we've each of us individually have had over how many decades. That you learn a Beethoven string quartet and you're like, wow, what an amazing piece. And then however many years later you come back to it and think, oh wow, there's something new that I didn't remember or didn't ever know about this piece. And then another few years go by and you come back to it again and yet again. There's just, I mean, I my one of my teachers, Bobby Mann, who had played any of the or all of the Beethoven quartets, I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of times, was still marveling at just new discoveries. So wherever you are with your relationship with Beethoven quartets, just know it's bottomless, absolutely bottomless.
exactly, exactly. The person in the Juilliard Quartet that I had the privilege of working with, a little bit Bobby Mann, not as much as Robert, but was Earl Carless, who played second violin in the Juilliard Quartet for many, many years. And I bring him up for two reasons. One, because he said something very similar to what you just shared, Robert. Earl talked about how he'd done at the point at which the Fry Street Quartet was working with him at Aspen, he had done, I don't know, like 25 Beethoven cycles. I mean, just incredible. I mean, he lived and breathed these scores and knew them like the back of his hand. And he said every time he gets on stage to play a Beethoven quartet, he notices something new. And he was just tremendously awed and humbled by that. And so kind of today as the last of these seminars, I really feel like what we're offering is just a beginning. It's just an entry point, you know, for a lifetime of living with this music. And it's such a privilege. It's such a privilege to get to do that. So I have a really great story that I want to start with about 59.3, which is from Earl Carlos once again. Hi Ariana, welcome. Um, and he liked to joke that that he was responsible for curing Lyme's disease. And the reason that he takes credit for this unlikely thing is he had a memorable performance of Opus 59, number 3, when he was a student at Meadowmount. And he actually was a violist in his quartet. And the first violinist was a very young, mischievous Itzhak Perlman. And the second violinist, and I'm embarrassed because I don't remember his name. They were on stage playing Opus 59, number 3. And if you've listened to it, you know that the last movement is really something, right? It's all this fugal material. It's fast as blazes. You playing it, it feels a little bit, if you're doing like you might go over the precipice at any moment. And the viola starts. And so in this performance at Meadowmount, they're coming through the coda at the end of the minuet, this sort of strange coda, and Itzhak and Earl lock eyes, and Perlman's got this glint in his eyes, like, let's go. And Earl's like, okay, let's go. And at that point, the second violinist like almost died of shock. So all of the blood drained out of his face. And Earl starts it fast as blazes. And anyway, the second violinist in that moment decided that he was going to be a doctor. And he became a famous doctor, and in fact did come up with the most effective cure for Lyme's disease. So it was Earl's and perhaps Beethoven's tempo marking that actually brought that little bit of good into the world as well. Or so he likes to say. So as we dive into this piece, I was thinking about in my preparations, you know, I'm not an historian or a theorist, and I was poking around the internet and I found what I think is a really fantastic 11-minute video lecture by a scholar named Michael Parloff. And I thought I would just screen share and let him take us through this really wonderful intro before we kind of dive into some specific listening of our own. So I am gonna open this and then share my screen. Okay. Give me 1 second here because we're gonna go to. Okay. All right, bear with me. sorry. I'm getting oh. I guess I have to give myself permission for how to screen share.
I just I don't know if it's considering me host back. I just gave you permission. Maybe that'll make it.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Sorry, let me try one more time. I've done this before and I've still got an exclamation point. You know what, Robert? I'm going to put this link in the chat and see if you can. So this is the YouTube and it's at 39 minutes.
Okay.
So while Robert's pulling that up, do you like the piece? And it's quite a virtuoso. I mean, all of them are in their way, but Opus 59.3 is sort of special in this way. Okay, there he is, our charismatic Beethoven scholar.
All right, let me know if this is not working for anyone.
Tonal ambiguity, which sustains itself. The final of these three quartets begins not with a sustained cello solo of operatic dimensions, nor does it begin with two terse karate chops. It begins with a dissonant, disconsolate wheeze. Which must have been very baffling to the early 19th century listeners. It's baffling enough to us today. And then rather than reassuring us and showing us where he is harmonically, he takes this more and more untethered harmonic spacewalk away from the harmonic mothership. It's weird. And it reminds a lot of people of the beginning of Mozart's so-called dissonance quartet, which begins similarly untethered. It reminds me a lot of the beginning of Haydn's Creation, where he begins by portraying chaos, primordial ooze, musically speaking, before creation. And if you know that piece, you know that eventually God comes in and says, "Let there be light." And C major comes flooding the hall in this great illumination. Eventually we get to C major as well in this Beethoven quartet, although it takes a somewhat circuitous route. We get to the beginning of the exposition, allegro vivace. We have a little up chord and a down chord like in an operatic recitative, and we think, oh, well, here we are. And yet, if you look, the up chord is a C major chord, but the down is a G7, which is unstable. It doesn't mean that we've arrived yet. And then as you'll hear the first violin goes off on this search for C major, and it passes through a lot of different keys before it finally discovers where it is in the 43rd bar of the piece. Thank God. And you know, we're going to hear these pieces back to back to back, and so it feels not only like the culmination of this whole beginning of this movement of this quartet, but it really feels, in a sense, like the culmination of the last movement of the previous quartet, which, as you recall, vacillated indecisively between C major and E minor, and it points up the mega quartet aspect of this trilogy of quartets. So we've gone from F major confidence to E minor wariness and nervousness, and now to this kind of athletic, again, confident third mega movement. Also, it's always interesting to ask yourself during the expositions of his movements, what's he going to seize upon to develop when we get to the development section? And interestingly, he takes that little up-down gesture and he makes quite a lot of it. I'll play you a section, for instance, where you'll hear it in dialogue between the cello and the viola, and then antiphonally between the lower components and the upper chord components of the quartet. If you spend a lot of time with these quartets, as I have this season, it becomes astonishing the number of moods that he generates. And yet the next movement, the one in A minor, I think is unique. It doesn't sound like anything else by Beethoven that I can think of. It has an exotic quality to it. You'll see in the opening phrase, there's an augmented second, which is a sort of stylistic indicator of what they call the style hongrois, the sort of gypsy-ish, exotic other. And some people think that since this movement, this piece, doesn't really have any formal Russian folk music in it, that this whole movement was intended to be Russified in some way. It was supposed to be Eastern European in its essence. And I think that's true, although it doesn't really sound Russian to me. It sounds more gypsy-like or even a bit Jewish. And this strange washtub bass, it really feels like, you know, this is folk music, so it just takes place around some fire in the backwoods area of Eastern Europe someplace. And the music takes on this rather obsessive quality, and it sways back and forth in this very fiddler on the roofish kind of a way. It's very poignant. It's got this sense of primordial pain. And later on, it becomes more clear-eyed, and it's like we are now smiling through our tears. It's like a dreamscape, and wherever it is, it's not downtown Vienna. And later, in the next movement, we come back to Vienna with a vengeance. It's in C major, and so classical, so rococo, that it seems like another kind of a dreamscape. It feels like almost operatic backstage music about a rococo ballroom someplace. first section, you have this squash-buckling band of young bucks who come in swaggering with rapiers at their sides. And the final movement is the one that surely spelled doom for amateur string quartets everywhere. Because it begins with this blistering gallop, this fugal, quasi-fugal gallop through the whole range of the string quartet at absolutely breakneck speed. I mean, it must have been the early 19th century equivalent of a ride in a Maserati. And it's not a fugue, it's fugal, but not a fugue. And in the middle, we have sections which really sound like Rossini, where you have these long crescendos and decrescendos that first start on the first violin and then drop sequentially through the whole range of the quartet. About 20 years later, in 1825, the 16-year-old Felix Mendelssohn wrote his octet. And I have a sense, because he was such a great fan of Beethoven, that he must have had this movement in mind when he wrote the last movement, which has passages such as this one. And in the end, he brings this movement and this quartet and this entire Opus 59 trilogy to a glorious, blazing conclusion. So go enjoy it. And
Well, if you didn't catch it, that was the Emerson recording, and an impressive tempo for the last movement, no doubt about it. Um, so I liked actually just this kind of overview of, Michael's lecture kind of covers a lot of the main points about the movement. It's very strange, dissonant opening, especially then, but even now, it's completely disorienting. And, you're there to hear a string quartet in C major, and you're pretty far away from it from the beginning. And then this meandering but somewhat Haydn-esque virtuosic writing in the first movement, especially for the first violin, but everybody gets their moment in that first movement. Then the second movement, which is this mesmerizing, like he called it a dreamscape, and there's a bunch of cello pizzicati, and there's sort of nothing quite like it in the other Beethoven quartets when I kind of think through them. It's quite a unique way of Beethoven expressing himself. He kind of stays content to wander for a really long time in that movement. And then And then, as Michael mentions, kind of yanking you straight back to Vienna for the menuetto, which is gracious and prim and proper. This kind of happy-go-lucky trio. He didn't talk about the coda, which serves as a transition to the last movement. That's back to strange, harmonically and a bit disorienting. And once again, we're lost in and have no idea that we're going to end up where we do in this fugue. And then the fugue also is just completely unique in its way. In my mind, this quartet also in many ways is a build all the way through to the end. The first movement, it's not that it doesn't begin with substance, it certainly does, but it's just searching, wandering, and then finally like transcends it all with this blazing fugue, and you finally get where you're going. And in that way, it's quite different in my mind than Opus 59-1, which starts with such confidence, right? And with such a grand beginning. When I think of 59-1, the movement I think of first is the first movement and the beautiful cello solo. And that's kind of what anchors it for me. And then the 59-2, and actually, Robert, I'd love to hear the way these pieces sort of live generally and in your brain's catalog too. 59-2 is kind of the tight construction Beethoven that we think of, where he's playing with motives, little tiny motives, and doing everything you can think of with it. I happen to love the slow movement of 59-2. It's one of my favorites of the whole output. And in many ways, there's this hymn-like quality to it. It's a bit simple, but the outer movements have that kind of that Swiss watch kind of construction. And then 59-3 is its own personality yet again, as I said, kind of in this drive to a conclusion that you've been fighting to find from the beginning. And in thinking about preparing for this seminar, I went back to, this is on your resource list, by the way, the Joseph Kerwin, the Beethoven quartets, Kerman, sorry, I said Joseph Kerwin, it's Kerman. And he talks about moving into the middle period. Actually, I'll read you what he wrote because it's sort of, it's slightly arrogant and funny. The three Razumovsky quartets constitute a trio of sharply characterized, consciously differentiated individuals, beside whom the earlier quartets look, regrettably, like pasteboard. Well, I could take issue with that statement. I do think all the Opus 18s are works of genius. It's such like antiquated, arrogant writing. But I like the notion of thinking of each of the 59s as individuals. You are entering a world, like when you meet a person, there's this whole kind of, it's everyone's unique. There's a whole world around them. You want to get to know them, and you get to know, each of these quartets is a commitment. They're big and long, and you live inside this other world. And so I liked that notion, especially in kind of wrapping up your introduction to each of these works, like letting them kind of hold their space. There was one other idea that I thought was interesting, which Michael Parloff mentioned briefly, about thinking of the Opus 59 quartets as a sort of mega work, with Opus 59 number 1 being a huge first movement, 2 being a huge second movement, and 3 being the ultimate third movement. And you can sort of pan back and think of them that way too. And in fact, any lens you take in thinking about these works, I think is interesting, because once again, you notice different things when you do that. but Robert, do you have anything you wish to add, or any of you actually? And now that you've had this introduction?
I really like the notion of thinking of the three pieces like three individual people, maybe from the same family, but clearly
Yeah,
very different individuals. You know, they have their own stories and their own objectives and their own agendas and their and different. There's element of great virtuosity. There's elements of great warmth. There's elements of great like victory. There's elements of tragedy, and all three of them, but expressed so very differently. It's and to I don't know, like if you compare the Opus 18 quartets to each other, you could definitely say the same thing. But they share a lot more of the same genes in the Opus 18s, and in the 59s they're really just kind of fully formed. It's kind of amazing. He must have had a kind of sense for these three pieces, you know, from the very beginning, like what he wanted to do and how they were going to occupy their own space and yet be, you know, this body of three pieces, which didn't really occur for the rest of his output. I mean, there was the Opus 18's F6, Opus 59's F3, and then everything else after that is a single group. And you could call the last five quartets the late quartets. They're sort of their own family too, but they really bust out in all kinds of ways that make it a lot harder for them to compare to each other compared to the Opus 59 quartets. They really are brothers and sisters there. So, yeah.
exactly. Yeah, they are. It's a special piece of output for sure in those ways. Thank you for that. I love that. And I wonder, as I mentioned, this is the beginning of a lifetime journey. So do download the document in the chat, which has a whole bunch of books. There's an article, and in fact, maybe at the end of the session, if we have time, we'll look at it together, because it's actually useful to know kind of what those resources offer as well. So, what I was thinking about in terms of diving into our listening today, I wanted to dive in a little bit, kind of with the mind of a performer, and how we can listen specifically um, to recordings to kind of to help anchor um, our instincts in certain ways. Like, I think sometimes we listen to a great recording, we love it, or we hear something we don't like and we sort of vaguely make note of it, you know? And actually, in learning these works and preparing for rehearsals and preparing your parts, I think listening with the score and with a mind towards how the artists are handling certain elements can really, really give you a jump on your work. And I wanted to, this is sort of a little bit more kind of a practical element, a little bit akin to kind of your excerpt classes in a way, but asking specific questions about not just what tempo is the group playing at, but how are they handling the pulse? Are there spaces for subito dynamics? What's the character of the pulse? How is the articulation supporting that? How are they treating dynamics? And then in your own preparations, I would say, so how are you handling the pulse? And more often than not in Beethoven, I will just point out a common pitfall, which is that one's own handling of the pulse is often not that there isn't an understanding of the rhythm. It's that actually your technical base is mucking up the rhythm a little bit so that you can't quite play evenly. Is there a shift? Is there a bow use thing? Is there uh, some metronome work you can do to expose those things so that you can actually render this music, much of which is really demanding virtuosically, violinistically. Um, in a way that is going to help you solve those problems. So I actually want us to listen to the whole piece together. And I loved the Alban Berg Quartet recording. And I'm wondering, have you guys listened to any of the previous quartets with the Alban Bergs? You have already. Oh, okay. I thought maybe this choice would be new, because I know you've listened to a bunch of different great recordings, and that's actually part of our aim in this seminar, is to expose you to kind of these great legendary quartets, because they've spent their lives thinking about this music, and there's a lot to be learned from them. But what I'd like you to do is get your scores, because I want us to do some listening with our scores. And let's actually, Robert, do you mind if I ask you to share your screen? I can put the link in,
Yep.
in the chat again. And maybe we may compare a couple of the last movement recordings too. Hopefully we'll have time to do that. But let's start with the Alban Bergs. I guess for no other reason than I really love what they do. And I want to ask you, we'll stop after the first movement, but I want to ask you to notice a few things so that you're ready to share actually at the end. I want you to notice if there are any things that you hear them do that you find thrilling. And if so, can you identify what it is you love about how it was handled? Is it the clarity? Is it the way that they're handling the dynamics? Is it just their sound? And if it's their sound, what is it? Is it the clarity of balance? Is it a warmth in the sound? Just see if you can be specific in your descriptions. And by the same token, I'd like you to see if there's anything that actually that you don't care for particularly. And the same reason, come up with a reason why too for that. So those are your marching orders for the first movement, and we've got our scores. And when Robert is ready, I will ask him to begin the recording.
You hear it now? Okay.
Yes.
Let's start over.
anybody brave enough to go first? Was there anything that thrilled you about hearing this music, about the performance, or about the music itself? Could be also just about the construction of the piece. Oh, come on. Elizabeth.
Well, I really loved like the interaction between the two violins, which is I think probably half and half the parts, and then also the performance. And it just seemed really easy and natural, like almost like one violin in some parts, which I really liked.
I have to agree. The passing, actually, I would say even between all the instruments in the quartet had this effortless quality to it that is pretty thrilling, I think. Yeah, I love that element too. Before I have a propensity to talk too much, so I'm going to stay out of the way and draw some more people out. Casey, you're smile. Oh, Ariana has a hand up. Casey, you're saved.
Yeah, I think this kind of goes along with what Elizabeth said, but all the 16th notes, like the runs have this kind of like a running effect, so it felt very thrilling in that manner.
That's such an interesting way to put it. There's a sort of seamless quality, and even when it's meandering, it's well. What did you notice about the pulse? Now I'm fishing a little bit, but in talking about this passing, this effortless passing, one of the things as a quartet player that is absolutely essential to that working is that the group is functioning inside the same pulse and inside the same pulse at its most sophisticated level. The character, not just that they're in the same tempo. What do I mean by that? Talk, yeah, elaborate on what is that exactly? Casey.
When I performed the Mozart clarinet quintet, my coach had talked a lot about the pulse. And when we had a coaching with another quartet, again, it was all about the pulse in terms of like, do you feel it in 4? Do you feel it in 2? Do you feel it in 1? Do you feel it in like 4-bar phrases as one unit? So I think that they had to sat down and talked about that in terms of like, let's not feel it in 4, even though it's written in common time, but rather feel it in 2 or even 1.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would say that I never experienced a moment of their performance in 4. And that, well, it's worth asking, like, why is it problematic to feel it in 4? Or what does expanding the pulse to these wider numbers, what does that do to the music? Why is that helpful? Why is that desirable?
It typically gives it more direction, and if you feel it in smaller units, the more choppy the phrase can become.
Exactly. Exactly. The idea can live and soar. And yes, you're still measuring time along the way, but it's time at different levels, and if it's held in one place, then your listener can't be transported through these larger ideas because they're held inside the details of the moment. Would be like speaking and emphasizing every syllable. It would be a little hard to track or want to stay with for 40 minutes. What else did you notice about kind of the about anything? And I can ask more specific questions if I need to. Yeah, Casey.
One thing I really commended to the performers was their balance, and this had to do specifically with the instrument groupings. For example, I think it was on the 5th page of the score I'm looking at. They had the first violin with the motive bum ba da bum ba da and then all 3 lower instruments would answer to that, and the first violin and the 3 lower instruments would be at the same dynamic level, which was quite remarkable. And even when they had the motives in the 2 lower voices and 2 upper voices that were repeated, it was kind of the same concept of like they equaled it out, and it was really cool to listen to.
Yeah. Yep. Once again, this sort of stunning clarity, right? And that comes from so many things, not the least of which is the performers really, really understanding the score, understanding that they're answering as a unit. So they need to create that sound in a particular way to function when things are being passed from one instrument to three and back again. That takes a special radar, um, for sure. I love that comment.
One
What
thing that I
about, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing that I particularly love about this recording is there's a really, I would say, successful and impressive balance. I'm really impressed with how they balance a certain sort of classicism approach and classical approach to string quartet playing and to the language with the incredible brilliance of the writing, right? It's very virtuosic, and so everyone's kind of playing all over the place. And I think that's one of the hardest things to balance in this piece. It's in a slightly different way than the other two quartets because it's very cheerful, it's very positive. It's also leaning a little bit more classical in terms of its overall style, at least this movement. And so, but you have just so many more notes to play and so many more problems to solve. And they do just a brilliant job of doing it. I can imagine. I think probably there are other recordings out there that have maybe a larger emotional palette to draw from, but most of those are nowhere near as clean as these guys are.
That's the thing. Yeah, exactly. That's, well, it's part of why I was so thrilled to hear this, because I guess I do think of this movement, and now I mean, this is just my opinion, and in thinking of this as a nod to Haydn, and this effortless virtuosity combined with, I mean, it's still Beethovenian. It's full of subito dynamics. It's full of surprises. It's full of a level of virtuosic demand that goes beyond anybody who'd come before. And to kind of to capture that beauty alongside all of the details that are Beethoven is a little bit rare. I think there's a danger, and this is worth talking about as a performer. When I'll hear a young quartet like play Opus 18 number 4, the C minor quartet, for the first time, it can, in the name of go for it, it can get a little brutalized. And you want to encourage like the dynamic range and the sense of like feeling powerful, and there is that element of Beethoven kind of shaking his fist at the heavens, but it can also just get a little ugly and messy. And part of that is just because the writing is so difficult to handle. And it's just another way of illustrating the flip side of what I think the Alban Bergs do so well, and they make it sound so easy. And in fact, what's really going on is they are all just masters of their instruments. And so they have this freedom to kind of to find this ease, which I think actually really serves the dimension of the score beautifully, because there's like I said, we're just getting started in this quartet. And so if you can kind of treat the happy C major music, with beauty and sensitivity, it leaves room for a wider journey, as you go towards the blazing fugue, when you've got, successive sforzandi and one string scale solos and all of that going on. I wanted to just, speaking of noticing things in a Beethoven score every time you hear it, I was just looking at like measure 180 in the first violin part and just the arpeggiation writing. And I'm like, oh, 59-1. Hello. And there's just always something that pops. But before we move on and leave this movement, I want to just take a moment to talk about some of the performance challenges of the introduction. Doesn't it look all innocent? I can tell you, those unison rhythms, and the hardest thing about that introduction is the rests. Speaking of pulse, this will test your group's shared subdivision like nothing else. And so that subtlety of moving through silence together as a group of performers and subtly cueing each other in, and then having a sense of pulse through the long notes with the way the bows are traveling, the way you're using vibrato. Vibrato is another form of subdivision. And so if everybody's wobbling every which way, that's not going to come out in the wash. And I just mention it as a friendly warning from a veteran to those of you starting your quartet careers, that the introduction is not to be taken for granted. You're trying to create this air of mystery and shock and wandering and all of these impossibly slow bows while you're still trying to maintain some mystery and suspense is harder than it looks on the page. So you've got to subdivide your tails off, okay? That's the deal. All right, well, any other thoughts on the first movement? I mean, once again, like, we could stay here for a week. But it also, I'm aiming to hopefully get through the piece. So maybe it is time to head to the second movement. And here too, I want to stick with the Berg for this movement as well, because I think they do a good job of hypnotizing their listeners. Wow. So, what what comes to mind when you hear this? I'll just say it again, it's a really unusual movement. And in some ways, this quartet doesn't, I mean, it's the slow movement, but it's so different from like the adagio slow movements, like the cavatina, or again, the E minor slow movement. Um, it's uh yeah, it's just its own thing. I always think about the goal with this movement to kind of try to hypnotize the audience, and it's in some ways it's searching and wandering without the kind of restlessness in my mind that often characterizes compartment. But what did you notice about either the playing, how it was handled, or about the movement itself? Yeah, Casey.
One thing I noticed and really enjoyed about this performance was the middle voices were written in ways that they both either had to act as a violin or act as a lower string. And I thought that this performance did a really those players did a really good job of making their sound more like a lower cello or a violin.
I love that. Yeah, the kind of bridging the ranges so that this journey is one journey. We're not we're not separated out by range.
One of the
Yeah,
unsung challenges of the inner voice role that just does not translate. Look, just looking at the page, that's what you have to do, but that's exactly what you have to do much of the
yeah,
time.
yep. And hopefully if you're in those roles you like doing that. You know, there I love seeing if I can sound like the viola, you know, or if I can sound like Robert, sound like the brilliant first violin. And I fancy that well, what I'm trying to do is to be able to trick the listener, you know, one way or another, if I can. And in this movement in particular, it's kind of essential to kind of to get all this chromatic meandering writing. And what about, well, it's just all the pizzas in the cello are striking, right? Often a pedal tone. And it's, again, it's just so strange for Beethoven to kind of stay in one place that long. And even that still doesn't mean that, I mean, harmonically, it's incredibly adventurous, like all his writing. Um, any any other thoughts about this movement? I'm conscious of the time. Yeah, Elizabeth, let's let you finish this off because we need to hear the end of this.
Well,
piece.
it just felt very disorienting to listen to. And I listened to a little bit of it without looking at the score and some of it looking at the score. And it was just so blended. And like Casey said, like all the voices are kind of sounding and mimicking each other. And so it was so beautiful. And like you said, like mesmerizing but very disorienting.
That's such an interesting way to put it. I love that notion. Is, yeah, once again, like in the context of the whole piece, you know, we've already talked about, we're desperately trying to head to C major and to victory, right? You know, at the end of this, and boy, we're really not getting there, you know, in this movement. But once again, like he seems oddly sort of content to sort of meander around and take his time with it, which again, I think is a sort of special element to this movement. Well, just looking at the clock, I think let's just stick with the Alban Bergs and listen from the minuet all the way through to the end. It's just incredible, isn't it? I can't help myself. I have to point out one thing that I love so much about playing this and finishing this. It's the second violin part, the two-note melodic figure, yadim, bottom, bottom, which is of course from the first movement, right? Yom beam, that two-note figure. He's at the very end of it, he's transformed it into this glorious, glorious motive that kind of carries with grace this element inside the blazing finish. It blows my mind every time. And it is such fun to play. I have to say that's one of the great second violin moments in the Beethoven quartets, getting to the finish of that, and you're the butterfly while your colleagues are like working their butts off.
It's just like the very end of the Mendelssohn octet.
That's right. Yes, it is. It absolutely is.
The first violin is chucking away with all the, and the second violin just has all the beautiful melody in the world.
Yes, I love playing that too. Yeah. I hadn't made that connection. Wow, that's another really important connection between those two works, isn't it? Well, final impressions. I didn't quite pace this as equally as I had hoped as I was guiding you through. But what I hope you were thrilled with with that music. And if yes, can you name something about it that something specific about it that's taking you there? Let's hear something from each one of you. Ariana, what comes to mind? There are no wrong answers.
I love the sort of the false finish in the fugue where you think it's done and then he just keeps going.
Yeah, I love that moment too. And it's important as a performer to kind of know that you're in on the trick. Elizabeth, what about you?
Um, well, I really loved how fluid everything was in the third movement. It just
Oh,
felt
yeah.
like really graceful. I really liked it. And then also, I have listened to a lot of movements of the fugue because I played it a few quarters ago at school at a very slow tempo, but I liked this tempo a lot. Like I feel like it was really exciting and thrilling, but I could like digest it and hear the notes.
Yeah, it's possible to go over the line, isn't it? And it's thrilling in its own way, but you can't quite hear everything. And the feat is just like, how did they even do that and stay together? This does, I think, kind of ride the line nicely. Casey, what about you?
I would say my favorite thing about Beethoven's quartet writing in general, which really shows in these opuses, is his inner voice writing. Just how there actually are prominent melodies and motifs that are presented. It's not like boring dotted halves and whole notes that, yes, they're important, obviously, but like this is also really cool.
Absolutely. No, he democratized things considerably. Equal partners. And yeah, and in that way, kind of, yet another way in which he was sort of a revolutionary. I think, this kind of he was a freelancer, this idea of the power of the individual, and also the power of the individual contributing to a whole in you can run with that metaphor a pretty long ways if you want. um well, what a pleasure to get to share this magnificent music with you as you're first discovering it. It's just the beginning of something really, really wonderful that's yours forever. So in this little resource document, bunch of books, I wanted to just mention, um, particularly there's an article from 1943, um, called oh, gall darn, what is it? It's by Rudolf Kolisch, and it's Beethoven's tempo and character. It's a study of his tempo markings and character. And it's a really deep dive into like what he meant by that. He famously actually did ascribe metronome markings to many, many of his works. And some of them, he was deaf. There have been hypotheses that his metronome was broken because they seemed impossible, either impossibly slow or impossibly fast. And there have been, it was Rudolf Kolisch who was kind of the first quartet player to like really not just dismiss it, but actually really, really look. And so by comparing all of the works across genres, he finds some really, really interesting things. And I will say that the kind of general takeaway is do pay attention to the markings, because even if you don't play them exactly, they inform something about the character. If it is impossibly slow, then you're looking to mine the depths of the dissonances and the harmony, the pain, or whatever it is the mood is amplified by looking to make it less easy and going slower. And by the same token, the fast and furious tempi that seem impossible, there's a striving there towards something that's also important. like the recording we just heard, I'm sure that tempo was arrived at with really careful consideration. So that's just a really useful thing to be aware of moving forward as players, and is really rich as a tool for your own interpretive journey, I would say, not because you have to do the number. Well, guys, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I hope we see you in person someday.
Agreed.
Well, you go get him and play Beethoven.
Thank you.
Enjoy, you guys.
Thank you. Would you be able to put that link to the document in the chat one more time?
Is it not there for you?
No, I think I joined late, so it didn't show up.
Here it is.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Bye.
Take
Bye.
care.